Hey everyone, Philippe here. So there's this nonprofit organization, and I've been a fan of them for a really long time. About a month ago, I learned about some pretty serious problems going on at that organization. Basically, workplace toxicity. There were a lot of staff members, former staff members, coming forward about problematic behavior by the CEO. Yeah, they were basically subject to workplace abuse. And I know that that's not a whistle you blow easily. Because when you work for a mission-driven organization, when you work for a nonprofit, it's usually not just because you need a job. You're usually ending up there, probably getting paid a little less than what you could be making elsewhere, and often doing more work than is on your job description because you really care about the cause. You have buy-in, you are dedicated, and you know that good work is being done. You've met the local people you are serving. You know a lot of people are doing good work that contribute to this, and it just sucks when one person's problematic behavior is kind of what ruins it. That's one of the things that upsets me the most too, is I think about everyday actors. A nonprofit organization is always more than just one person, but when it is tied to the ego of one person, that puts everybody else in such a bad position. I wish I could say that this was the first time something like this had happened, but it's honestly starting to feel like this is becoming a yearly event, where every year I learn about another organization that I'd looked up to and respected for some time, having all these things come out. And that's usually the same stuff over and over. It's either like assault allegations against a founder or CEO or something, or it's workplace toxicity. At first I wanted to make a video highlighting the role all of us have to play in that, whether we work in nonprofit organizations, whether we just try and support stuff we care about by giving financially to causes. But then I realized there's a lot of introductory stuff that I don't think is very common knowledge about nonprofits, and they're very helpful things to know. I've worked at nonprofits for over a decade, ranging from small startup-y organizations with everyone in their 20s still figuring stuff out, to larger multi-million-dollar international ordeals. And yeah, there's a lot that isn't well known to people who are just casually looking for a good cause. So that's what I'm about to dive into here. When I first discover an organization, there are a few questions, a few things I want to make sure I feel comfortable with, and I thought I would share those with you. Let's go. So in the digital world we live in, you should be able to do all the research you need to do on an organization online in a few various spots. You'll want to pull up an organization's website. By the way, I'm using the Nature Conservancy, Love 146, and World Relief stuff as examples. I chose them because they are very different organizations in terms of size, in terms of the issues they take on, but they have a website design and an online presence that allows for this. Anyway, here's some stuff you might want to have at your fingertips. First, the organization's website. That seems like a given. Next, if they've got a section that says something like our work, our program, what we do, pull that up, that'll be helpful. Then they should have a financials page. You may need to look in the footer, but pull that up wherever it is. Now, oftentimes the financials page will provide you at least two documents, so the ones you'll want to look for are the annual report. Get the most recent years. If it's early in the year, don't be surprised if the date seems a bit behind, but it shouldn't be more than 2 years old. You'll also want to look for a 990 form. If you can't find one, that's not great, but there are other ways you can find it. I'll let you know in a sec. And if you see something that's called an impact report or that looks like one, grab that. That's a bonus. Okay, go to the site, and it's also going to be helpful to pull up a few of their social media profiles. Beyond that, you can go to a site like GuideStar or Charity Navigator to look up the organization. These are some big third-party platforms that evaluate nonprofits. I'll be completely honest, I have some concerns over a few big picture things that they normalize in the nonprofit world, and I'll provide context for that in a little bit. But overall, they can help pull up red flags and make it easy to access documents like the 990. Now with these resources, let me show you how I evaluate a nonprofit. There's 3 areas I'm going to look at: impact, stewardship, and culture. Yeah, if I'm going to give to an organization, I want to make sure that they are going to be effective in helping me make the change I want to see in the world. I want to know that they're going to be good stewards of the resources I give them. And I want to make sure that their culture, the way that they do things, is aligned with my values. Let's talk about impact. You wouldn't support an organization and give them money without knowing how they were going to use it exactly, right? I guess, but it's actually surprisingly easy to just caught up in the big picture vision of what an organization is all about without knowing their specific plan to get there. Like, I like the Nature Conservancy. I like their materials and their articles, and if I just check their site, it says pretty broadly that they are creating a world where people and nature can thrive. That's great, but how? Okay, I see here they are seeking to conserve land and waters. They're in 70 plus countries, they're working with over 400 scientists, but what are they all doing? Oh good, a how we work button, this should help. I can see here that they support scientific research, they aim to influence public policy and business decisions, partner with indigenous and local communities. Oh yeah, this is better. Honestly, it's still a bit vague for my tastes, but I think a lot of that comes from just how broad the Nature Conservancy works. They're quite a large organization. And I can find some of that stuff in better detail. Like if I look into this policy section, I can see here how they helped Belize develop a debt for nature swap to protect their coral reefs. So there are specifics to be found. Now that I know what they're doing, I want to know if they're doing a good job at it. And that's where these impact reports come in handy. One thing I try and look for is outputs versus outcomes. So outputs are the thing you do, like having an after-school program, but outcomes are the results you're hoping to see because you keep doing that thing. Like, it doesn't really matter if I have 7,000 kids sign up for my after-school program if this program doesn't make a discernible difference in their lives. In their impact report, I can see that Love 146 provided long-term services for 189 youth. And that's an output. But as a result of that, 52% were attending school, 85% were in school, working, or graduated, and 78 people can name 3 or more support persons they have in their life. Those are good outcomes. I should note that outcomes can be difficult to measure. Like, you often have to survey people or compare results to a control group. Some organizations use a tool called a theory of change, and some organizations even publish theirs and make it public. If the one you're checking out does, I highly recommend checking that out. It shows you how their outputs connect to their broader vision. The other thing I look for is if organizations are aware that they have a lot of influence and if they're using that influence well. You know, there are a lot of times where an organization only wants to deal with an immediate problem without addressing the broader systemic context that creates it. I think one example might be something like being a hunger organization in the US. And you can keep doing food drives, and that's good, but, you know, people are looking to you as an expert in hunger. And so are you educating your donors and volunteers on things like food deserts and food policy? Are you using your voice well in that regard? All right, you know I didn't have you open up that annual report and that $9.90 for nothing. Let's talk about financials and money. Okay, so first question, how hard was it for you to find that stuff? My thought is that organizations should be transparent, and that means making these documents easily accessible. Now, although annual reports are pretty common documents, pretty common publications, there isn't really a standard template for how one should look. There's some that are real minimalist and that rely on large photography. Others are a lot more info-rich, and you'll see all kinds of content. But no matter what, these should offer a snapshot of what the organization is like, what sort of work they did in the past year, and they should have a financials page, which is one of the most important parts. And all that stuff should also be available on the organization's website. A lot of that same info will also be on the 990 form, but it's gonna look a lot more technical since this is an IRS document. Some of the stuff you'll see here is pretty simple. You'll see total revenues, total expenditures, aka how much money is coming in, how much is going out, but you should see that in the annual report as well. Line 15 is pretty interesting because you'll see how much is going towards salaries, and in line 5 you'll see the amount of people employed. So you can kind of divide the bottom number by the top number and get a rough estimate for average salary. What else is interesting is that in part 7 of a 990, you can see the senior leadership positions and their specific salaries. I look into this stuff so I can ask questions like, am I just okay with how this money is being used? Is anyone overpaid or underpaid for their work? Now real quick, I am not someone who thinks working at a nonprofit means you need to be paid dirt cheap. In fact, I think there's a strong case to be made for paying CEOs well and attracting top tier talent to a leadership position at an organization. But one thing I will find a bit questionable is if the pay rate for the CEO is leaps and bounds beyond the average salary or an entry-level position, that's a little more concerning. Well, sometimes that question is a bit misleading, right? Because it seems unattractive to be paying somebody's salary, but really what you're doing is paying for the time and the human effort that it takes to make the work happen, make the stuff happen, whether that's putting kids in school or feeding hungry families. When you look at a nonprofit budget, it'll typically break down into two categories. There will be programs, that means all the direct stuff that people support, that the organization does, whether that's a meal program, tree planting, survivor care, all that. Overhead is the stuff that it takes to run as an organization, the computers, the office equipment, fundraising events, though sometimes you might see fundraising split up as a separate category. I want to address a popular misconception here. A lot of donors think that the ideal organization is one that tries to minimize overhead as much as possible so that more money can go to the programs that are more directly helping people. There's historically been kind of like an unspoken rule in nonprofits that an 80-20 ratio is good, 80% programs, 20% overhead, 70-30 is okay. But a few years ago, this guy, Dan Pallotta, gave a really compelling TED Talk as to why that might not be the best case.
You can't use money to lure talent away from the for-profit sector. You can't advertise on anywhere near the scale the for-profit sector does for new customers. You can't take the kinds of risks in pursuit of those customers that the for-profit sector takes. You don't have the same amount of time to find them as the for-profit sector, and you don't have a stock market with which to fund any of this, even if you could do it in the first place, and you've just put the nonprofit sector at an extreme disadvantage to the for-profit sector on every level.
I get it. It's more sexy to think that your donation is going to plant trees or give food to hungry families in Ethiopia rather than paying for my laptop. But guess what? I can't talk to my colleagues and my partners in Ethiopia without this laptop, so that either or illusion doesn't really accurately reflect how the process works. And here's one of my favorite points that Dan Pallotta makes.
And the median compensation for a Stanford MBA with bonus at the age of 38 was $400,000. Meanwhile, for the same year, the average salary for the CEO of a $5 million plus medical charity in the US was $232,000, and for a hunger charity, $84,000. It's cheaper for that person to donate $100,000 every year to the hunger charity, save $50,000 on their taxes, so still be roughly $270,000 a year ahead of the game, now be called a philanthropist because they donated $100,000 to charity, probably sit on the board of the hunger charity, indeed probably supervise the poor SOB who decided to become the CEO of the hunger charity.
Awareness is shifting in this area, and I think he can honestly be credited for a lot of that shift. But you can still see remnants of this mindset, and that's why this ratio of overhead to programs expenditures is one of the first things you see on Charity Navigator's profiles. That's how normalized this expectation is in the nonprofit world. Now, you know I was motivated to make this video because of the failure of an organization that I had looked up to. And it wasn't a failure of their programs, it wasn't a financial failure, but at the end of it, it was a failure that came from the organization's culture. I'll be honest, this is a harder thing to evaluate because an organization isn't reporting on their internal workplace culture with an impact report or an annual report or IRS documents. You kind of have to look between the lines. But like I mentioned earlier, this is the thing, more than any other thing, that has led to the demise of nonprofits that I've seen over the past few years. So what do you need to look for? What questions are worth asking here? I want to see how an organization approaches and handles power and equity. Check it out. If you're a nonprofit organization, you're usually working with a group of people who are disadvantaged or marginalized in some way, whether that's economically or culturally. The group that you are aiming to help probably has less power. On the flip side, making significant contributions to charity requires privilege. It requires having the finances that allow you to make large sums. In other words, a lot of donors of organizations are people who typically have a lot of power. Culturally, they're typically coming from parts of society that have more advantages. And so nonprofits are at a really interesting position in between these two worlds that are often widely different. But truly wise organizations will recognize and have foresight to how this imbalance in power and how these different perspectives can potentially cause tricky situations. And they'll try to be proactive about building bridges and effective partnerships that erode an us and them mentality. It's easier said than done, but I can see how some of these dynamics play out internally, and one of the quickest ways is to just take a visual glance at an organization's staff page, especially if it's one that happens to have a bunch of photos posted. I'll be honest, in the nonprofit sector at large, you'll see an overrepresentation of white millennial women in entry to mid-level positions, and an overrepresentation of white men in senior leadership positions, particularly at large organizations. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that a staff page with a bunch of white faces means that the org is doing something wrong. There are broader systemic things that lead to this that go beyond any single organization. But it is really refreshing when I see that an organization is doing what they can in order to change this. More and more I hear people say they just want to support organizations with teams with leaders that look like the people they're trying to serve. I get that. Like, the white savior complex has created a lot of harm, especially internationally or in cross-cultural situations. And I'm not a total purist in thinking that people not from a community don't have a role to play in helping or serving that community. But I do want to know that locals are involved and upheld and included, and that they have some level of final decision making. One thing that's an increasing red flag is if an organization is built on a cult of personality. But one thing that I find encouraging is when multiple people at an organization are given a platform. It shows me that there's not a fear of sharing the stage, of passing the mic. There's an awareness that a band beats a solo act when it comes to creating change. Finally, I'm curious about an organization's messaging. Ethical storytelling is a huge passion of mine, and I'm not actually going to spend a whole lot of time on this topic because I already did. I made a whole video on that, but what I will do is I'll scan social media posts, I'll want to read website copy, and what I'm trying to ensure is that there's not a bunch of appeals to white saviorism, that it's not talking about poverty in an exploitative way. We're not just trying to make people feel like pity parties, and I also don't want them to go so overboard in the other direction where they're just romanticizing poverty either. Anyways, impact, finances, culture. These are a few of the check boxes I look for before I try and support an organization with my money. You know, in spite of all the scandals you hear and stuff, there are still a lot of good organizations out there doing good work. Please do not let the misbehaviors of an actor or a single organization or just one person at an organization put on a coat of cynicism that stops you from engaging charity altogether. You know, do the work, look into them, look at their impact, look at their finances and their culture. Hopefully some of what I shared is helpful, and I really hope you find an organization you're excited and enthusiastic to support. I've really seen people come alive by finding a cause that they care about and that they can invest their energy in. There are a few other resources I want to point you to. I mentioned the Dan Pallotta TED Talk, watch that. There's a blog I like, nonprofitaf.com, I think. Just go look that up, Nonprofit AF, and a podcast called The Ethical Rainmaker, kind of diving into the more trickier nuances of nonprofit work. I'm really curious if this provoked further questions, things you might be wondering, and if it did, please ask. I leave them in the comments. Maybe I'll do a follow-up to this, responding to specific questions. I would love to get enough of a response to generate that. In the meantime, like, subscribe, keep coming back for more, and stay curious, friends.